This week and next week are the last 2 weeks of the church year, and next week is called Christ the King Sunday. It has to do with if you summarize all of who Jesus is, the Gospel of John will tell us that he's the one who's reigning in power even now. And I think I'm going to do something that will actually take one part and two parts. This will be part one. The next week is the first Sunday of Advent. We're going to have the same kind of end times visions where sun and moon are darkened, apocalyptic language will come to us. And I will not be here on December the 2nd. Mark Crawford will be here. I'm thankful for my colleague being here, and I'll leave to him how he will handle that. But today, two words will help us understanding. Two words from today's gospel will help us understanding what it's about. Birth pangs and temple. Birth pangs was a common way for Jewish people, for a long time actually, by the time of Jesus, long time, they had used this phrase. Jews had used this phrase for what would happen when God would visit the world with his Messiah and make all things right. Birth pangs sounds a bit horrible, and if you've been pregnant, you would know that, and perhaps if you've watched someone giving birth, you would know that birth pangs are actually very painful and a form of kind of agony. So it doesn't sound very good, but remember, birth pangs are to lead up to, when all goes well, a child. A child. That's the hope. Birth pangs aren't for the sake of themselves. They're for something else that is good and desirable. And in Mark's gospel, there is dramatic language like this used. He's got an immediate thing happening. And for example, when other gospel writers talk about the heavens being opened and a dove coming down at Jesus' baptism, Mark used the word ripped. The heavens are ripped open, as though they're never going to be put back together. It's not like the Astrodome that puts its little, thing, or not the Astrodome, but the, Minute Maid Park, putting its roof back. Not like that. It's been ripped open, and it's not going to be repaired. It's open now. The way to God, a new way with God, is being opened up to us. And so, labor pains would be much more commonly understood about what was happening in Jesus' day than in our own day, certainly among children, because it was a semi-private affair. You were in a community, you didn't have soundproofing, you might have had not much for windows or whatever, but when a woman was in labor, half the community knew about it. And the kids, if there were around, they would hear the sounds. They would see the concern. Labor was known. Nowadays, kids learn about labor and how it all happens, sometime in junior high in a sex education school, if the parents haven't taught them, or they might get it on YouTube or who knows what. But it happens later. Kids from their very earliest years understand labor is something we go through, but there's the hope of something really good that's going to be produced out of this. And so the Jews, when they reflected on the way in which God was going to come, as they believed it, was going to come to bring birth, like a new birth, to this world, to the peoples of the earth, God's new creation, the age to come where justice and peace, truth and mercy would at last flourish. The great prophets and many other writers used this kind of language. They would herald the new birth and a new day. We know that Jesus believed that in his very presence, somehow in the baptism, he got a really clear understanding of who he was to be. He was God's anointed, God's Messiah. Before that, not sure what he thought, but he thought something was pretty special probably. But then, in that baptism, the heavens open, he hears the voice, "You are my Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And when he goes to his first preaching gig that we hear about, when he gets up, he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And then he announces this new day. And it's not about, as some often think when they see just a short 8 verses or so like this is not about the end of the cosmos. This is not about the end of history. Jesus' words, so you got birth pangs, and then you have temple. Jesus' words are focused on the temple. He'd been asked a question. It wasn't really a question. It was like, wow. It's like the disciples that disciple had never been to Jerusalem to see the temple. This is their first occasion to be in Jerusalem. And they say, these stones are so incredibly huge, and this building, it's so magnificent. And Jesus says, well, it's not going to last. It was undoubtedly the most magnificent building people had seen, one of the largest structures for hundreds of miles around, and beautiful, beautiful. Jesus, solemnly predicts that the whole thing will be demolished. Just 2 days earlier, he had enacted something about the functioning of the temple. Mark has him coming into Jerusalem and turning over the money changers' tables. Rather, again, in violent language. Mark uses violent language. He turns over the money. This is over. No more of this. This is not honoring God. This way is going to be finished. And then, with the pronouncement on the temple, the disciples were kind of confused. They weren't sure what to make of these kinds of comments and this kind of action. And not one stone will be left on top of another. So they say to him, when they get to a private place, looking down on the building now from the Garden of Olives, they look down and they say, tell us then, when is this going to happen? They don't know what else to ask. Before the week is over, Jesus is going to be tried and crucified. This is his last week. They'll watch in horror as he goes through trials, beatings, and crucifixion. And, for them, they'd given up everything. Their livelihood, their family, just left behind. They'd been following him around for a while. For them to think that he was going to die wasn't the end of the cosmos, but it was the end of the world, of their world. They'd given up everything to follow him. And then he says to them, if you keep following me, you're going to have the same fate. You will face beatings and trials and threats of death. And the kind of experience that I've had of hatred and opposition and resistance, that's what I've encountered. You're going to encounter the same thing as my followers. So he was preparing them for this. It was going to be, so Jesus' death was going to be the end of the world as they knew it. What do they do then? Even when he died, after his death, some said, what do? Go back and pick up our nets? Just forget this whole chapter happened at all? But then there's the second half. Within the disciples' lifetimes, within about 35 years from the time that Jesus is here commenting on the temple itself will be a pile of rubble. Not unlike what you see on your bulletin cover, if you had seen that coming in. At that time, their lives would be subject to those trials and beatings and threat of death. They had to wait, but they'd been forewarned. So the context for these events and his predictions is very, very important. Next week, I'll hit this much more strongly and much more detailed way, historically, but the meaning of them is not obvious as we read on the page in our own time and place. What is the relevance of the ending of the sacrificial system, and particularly the destruction of the temple? What is the relevance of that to our lives, to you, to me? Well, a couple thoughts here. One is that thoughts about the future they're uncontrollably something that we think about. We don't have to decide to do it. We think about the future. When will it happen when? What happens in the when, way out there? We're curious about that, and our faith speaks to this. Secondly, Christians have this topic come up because it's part of the Bible. And when it comes up, we shouldn't just have a glazed sort of look and a sort of well, I have no idea. We should be able to at least have some thoughts, some grounding in what does it mean, this destruction of the temple? Why such violent language? And then thirdly, Jesus has a message here, and it's not just for his disciples 2,000 years ago. It means something for us. And then lastly, God is at work in the world. God is at work in your life, in my life, in the events of the world, and we're called to be alert. We're called to be engaged. We're called to be discerning and understanding. And to make sure we're not, because God's making some things happen, we're going to try to make sure we're not opposing that. We ought to know what to celebrate, what to patiently endure, what to hope for, what to oppose, and how to pray in our lifetimes. I got to thinking about last week's litany in the wake of the latest mass shooting. We said it at both services, and it was long, just recalling the various places where mass shootings had happened. And what's curious about this, as I reflected on it, was I received basically no feedback from the congregation. And it just caused me to wonder, what did that mean? We had a little conversation in the staff about it, but that was quite deliberate, and I brought it up. But outside of that, really nothing. And so I wonder if, when we were praying that, if we were coming together around our shared value of human life. Might have. That we all agree we mourn and don't want to see any more of this. Children in schools, people at work and worship. Or, I wondered. My curiosity got to wondering, did I raise a concern in you? You wonder if Father Jeff is on the right side of this whole issue in our culture today. Second Amendment. I wouldn't knowingly preach my own opinions about things, and that wasn't an effort to make any sermon. Nobody said it was. I wouldn't state my own opinions unless I state them as such, as though it's God speaking. I wouldn't preach partisan politics. But I just wonder, let's say you had a suspicion that maybe this was motivated to sort of prompt some sort of thought or feeling in some direction on the issue. What would that mean? Can we, if you discovered that actually in a conversation I do have opinions about those political matters myself that I can talk about openly one-on-one but would never preach from the pulpit? Can we have conversations about that if we're on different sides? Can we see where we have some shared values, like the securing of our society? Everybody would like to have a safe society. We just don't know how to get there. There's different ways to get there. Can we both love Jesus? I can say this much. I do have opinions, strong opinions, just as you do. But I don't pretend to have the answers on complex issues. What we need to be wrestling with is God's coming kingdom and getting our beliefs, values, and behaviors aligned with it. If you want a short course in Episcopal beliefs, and I think good ones, look at that prayer book that's in front of you. There's tons of prayers in that book. It's the reason why they call it a prayer book. There's lots of prayers. That will help you understand, what does God want? What is God yearning for? What is God's kingdom? What does God's reign look like? Those prayers will answer that question. And I want you to know, I'm still open to hearing from you about last week's litany, but I don't need to. I was just curious about what silence meant in that rather shocking liturgy that brought me to tears every time I read it. About 5 weeks ago, a member of my family experienced what probably felt like the end of her world. My 88-year-old mother lives in a secured facility where people need memory care. And she suffers dementia that progresses with each passing month. She lived near one of my sisters. I have 3 sisters and a brother. She lived near one of my sisters, but then something happened and she needed to be moved. We thought that she'd be there for the rest of her life, but she had to be moved, which was disconcerting for her and for all of us. And then she lived next to another sister in New Jersey. And she's on the 2nd floor with other residents. And there are special codes. I visited there. I learned about these special codes when I visited in late August. Needed to operate the elevator to get up and to the 2nd floor and off back down to the 1st floor. So the people on that floor can't operate the elevators. About 5 or 6 weeks ago, a pipe burst and some rooms on the 2nd floor had some flooding. They weren't sure how much water, but you and I both know that it doesn't matter. A half an inch of water across your whole floor, and it changes a lot of things. And so it happened at night while just only a very few staff were working, and the few persons on that floor that night worked quickly and diligently with the safety and security of the residents in mind. My mother was moved to another room in the middle of the night. Now, this was not the end of the world, a pipe bursting in a building, but it seemed to her like the end of her world. Persons with memory issues can be extra sensitive to change in routine. And to be flooded would cause my mother to wonder what was happening. It's likely she didn't understand what a burst pipe meant, even if the staff tried to explain it to her. Moving her would have seemed very wrong in the middle of the night. And what's all this water doing here? Imagine if you had someone remove you from your home for reasons you could not understand. Even though we can see that moving from room 212 to 216 on that same floor, and 216 was unoccupied, that wouldn't mean much in terms of change. I mean, the dimensions of the rooms were identical. But still, she was now in unfamiliar surroundings. It was her dresser she would miss. It was her rocker she wouldn't see. It was her bathroom she wouldn't enter. Again, not the end of the world, but for her, a cataclysm, the apocalypse. When we hear about the temple in Jerusalem tumbling down, or even predictions of it, it may not be the end of the world, but for the people of that day, that's how they could best describe it. That was the language they had. It's all coming down, everything. Because look, what would the Jewish people be without the sacrificial system and without the temple? The center of their life, religiously, politically, socially, the center of everything. And what they thought was going to be the light of the world, the center of the new world. So that was one issue. My 4 siblings and I needed to get on the same page. This was a cataclysmic event for our mother. Let's talk about it. And of course, we came quickly to our shared value that we want our mom to feel safe and actually be secure. The staff had taken care of that, but then we got some troubling news. This had happened days before we were told. My sister Elizabeth, whom lives now about 2.5 miles away, learned about it when she went to visit days later. And we wondered, when were you going to tell us? Why hadn't you told us that night or the very next morning? And then we wanted to know, well, what's the plan for her to return to her room? How long would it be before it was ready for her? We had questions. Our basic question was answered. Did they care for my mom in the emergency? Yep, and we're glad about that. But now our question is, will they keep us informed of major changes the next time something happens? And we weren't so sure, given their explanation that prevented us from getting contacted. We were told that the staff nurse or nurses that night were so preoccupied with caring for the residents in an emergency that they overlooked that step of contacting the families as soon as possible. And we just simply said, we're going to say to that, no, that's not the way it should work. In your building, you ought to have a protocol in emergencies, and the staff collectively need to check off each box in that protocol. And the manager, if the staff doesn't do it, ought to go back over that and say, did you, and check off the boxes. We wanted to know, is there a protocol? What happened? And then we learned that it was just human error, exhaustion, the emergency, being rattled, all the work they had to do. Okay, it was overlooked. They do have a protocol. We can feel good about my mom staying there in that place. This was not likely to repeat. When Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, when he goes in just a few days earlier and violently overturns tables, people want to know, does he share our values? Does he care about us? Is he one of us? And of course, the answers will vary. The temple priests and the money changers would say, no, he's an outsider. He disrespected the temple. This was our holiest of holy times of the year. This is Passover. He ruined it for us. This was economic security for many, many families. He can't be for us. On the other hand, Should there have been an oppressed worshiper who's been excluded from any of that due to some illness or disease or national identity? Could have been gender or being too poor to afford one of the turtle doves that person might have thought that the destruction of the temple and the ridding of the sacrificial system was actually a very good thing, long overdue. What kind of God inhabits and sets up such a system? Oppressive and exclusive. We're coming to Advent when we herald the birth of Jesus. Mary's Magnificat, we will say, where the rich are sent away empty and the poor are filled. That will create comfort for some, but anxiety for others. The good news isn't uniform for all people. Sometimes preaching the good news is going to confirm our values. Your values, my values, our values. Sometimes it's going to challenge our values. Sometimes we might be unable to we might be unable to name what's happening with any precision, but something was disturbing. Not sure I liked that message. And here's another reality. As the preacher, as any preacher, I have my own filters operating. What I might see as good news might be seen by you very differently. I need to recognize and admit my own values, my own filters, and recognize when there's not just one and only one gospel value at work, either in a time or a place or a passage of Scripture. When I preach, I hope you know, I am my first audience. Many times I'm preaching to myself as much as to anyone else. I need to hear God's word. I need to change my thinking or my habits. I need spiritual renewal. I'm a work in progress. God uses you in my life as much as he does me in yours. Now you remember when Jesus preached his first hometown sermon, where he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." The congregation at first liked what he said. But then he used it in an illustration that seemed like, oh no, that's not an illustration we all understand. It was about an outsider being favored by God. And by the end of the service, there was a mob of them who wanted to push him off a cliff. True. What we one more. Probably the most celebrated of his parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan, would have been widely disliked by all Jews, especially by priests and Levites who were put in a bad light, as though they were lacking compassion, lacking sensibilities, on the wrong track. What we 5 siblings decided to do was each call the staff manager to, first off, appreciate the work they did to secure my mom's safety, and to register our concern about not being contacted about this at all. And that each of us would say that we understand they have protocols that would and should have been covered, and we expect this to be done in the future. We weren't snarky, we weren't complaining, we weren't whining, we just wanted to register so that they know what's important to us. Because we love our mom. Not because we want to complain. You know, the destruction of the temple is God exercising God's reign, God's power to create the kind of world God wants to envision, a new world coming into being. As Jesus enters the scene, that's got to go. Because it doesn't represent the love of God. It can't. It wouldn't. And a new and living way had to come into being. And it meant destruction. And it meant a lot of people really wondered about God and about Jesus and about this good news. But underneath it all was God's love for all peoples. Every single one. What helped Jesus' followers was they saw his love. They saw it for others of all kinds. They felt it themselves without partiality. He was fair and loved everyone. His words are a matter of life and death, of inclusion and exclusion in God's reign. His words direct our very lives and our loves. So we want to hear them well. But the prediction of the temple was the last straw for the powers that be in Jerusalem. That's it. He has got to go. And it was days before that was true. Here's the interesting thing. When he was charged in the trial, they alleged that he said he would destroy the temple and raise it back up in 3 days. That's not what he said. He said it would tumble down. Passive voice. When someone or something threatens people's values, they often will distort the truth just enough to get other people on their side, just to be sure they get their way, even if they have to fudge a little bit. My job, my friends, my job in the pulpit is not to please you, but to challenge you and comfort you. It's not to make you happy. It's to help you see Jesus and love him more and walk with him. My job is to preach the coming of the kingdom, to preach God's kingdom values, whatever they may be, and however they may conflict with your life, the life of this church, the life of our town, the life of our nation, to preach God's kingdom values in such a way that helps us embrace Jesus, Lord of all, King of kings, and the coming kingdom, as God's beloved sons and daughters, and servants of his eternal reign in glory.